The stars looked the same as they always did from the observation deck of Valoran Prime's capital city. High Chancellor Neth pressed his four-fingered hand against the cool glass and watched the distant lights twinkle in the darkness. His people had always found peace in watching the stars. For thousands of years, the Valorans had lived in harmony with 12 worlds spread across their small corner of the galaxy. They grew food, built beautiful cities, and raised their children under the light of friendly suns. War was something they read about in old books, not something they lived through. But tonight, the stars brought only fear. "Chancellor," came a voice behind him. Neth turned to see his aide, a young Valoran named Kit, holding a datapad with shaking hands. "The communication from Thaler has stopped completely. Just like the others." Neth felt his heart sink deeper into his chest. Thaler was the third world to go silent in as many months. First Karas, then Volus, and now Thaler. 3 entire planets, billions of lives, gone without explanation. Well, that wasn't quite true. They had an explanation, but it was so horrible that most Valorans refused to believe it. "Show me the last transmission again," Neth said quietly. Kit activated the datapad with reluctant fingers. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the final message from Thaler's Planetary Defense Center. The image was grainy and filled with static, but the terror in the speaker's voice came through clearly. "They're everywhere. The bioships are landing in every major city. The creatures, they're not just killing us, they're changing us, converting our people into something else. The defense grid is down. They're consuming everything. Plants, animals, even the soil itself. Please someone help us, anyone. We can't stop them." "We can't." The transmission cut to static. Neth had watched this recording dozens of times, but it never got easier. The Devourers had finally reached Valoran space. Everyone had hoped the stories were just rumors from the Outer Rim, tales told by frightened traders and refugees. But the evidence was undeniable now. The Devourers were real, and they were coming for all of them. "Have we heard anything from the Galactic Council?" Neth asked. Kit's ears drooped, a sign of deep disappointment. "Among his species, the Zenthan Empire says they cannot spare ships for our defense. They claim the Devourers are too dangerous and unpredictable." The Crystalline Collective gave the same response. "They suggest we evacuate our remaining worlds and seek refuge in their territories. Abandon our homes," Neth whispered. "Leave everything our people have built for thousands of years." "The council meeting is in 1 hour," Kit said. "The other chancellors are waiting for your decision." Neth nodded slowly. He knew what he had to do, even though it went against every peaceful instinct his people possessed. The Valorans would have to fight, or they would die. But how could a species that had never known war hope to survive against something that had consumed entire sectors of the galaxy? The council chamber was filled with anxious voices when Neth arrived. Representatives from all 12 Valoran worlds sat around the curved table, their faces showing the same mixture of fear and desperate hope. They all looked to him for answers he didn't have. "My friends," Neth began, his voice carrying across the silent chamber, "we face the end of everything we have ever known. The Devourers have taken 3 of our worlds, and they will not stop there. The major powers of the galaxy have refused to help us. We stand alone." An old chancellor named Vale spoke up from across the table. "Perhaps we should accept the Crystalline Collective's offer. Evacuation might be our only choice." "And become refugees forever?" another voice countered. "Live in camps and settlements, dependent on the charity of others? Better than being consumed by monsters," Vale replied. The argument that followed was heated but brief. Everyone knew the truth. They couldn't evacuate 12 worlds. Even if they tried, the Devourers would eventually reach those territories too. Running would only delay the inevitable. "There is one option we haven't discussed," Neth said, raising his hand for silence. "We send out a general distress call. To every corner of the galaxy. Not just to the major powers, but to everyone. Maybe someone will answer. Who would help us that hasn't already refused? Kit asked. I don't know, Neth admitted. But doing nothing guarantees our destruction. At least this way, we're fighting until the end. The vote was unanimous. Within hours, the Valoran communication stations across all remaining worlds began broadcasting the same message to every corner of known space. It was simple and direct, carrying the weight of desperation that only comes from facing extinction. Message traveled through hyperspace relays and communication networks, reaching thousands of worlds and countless species. Most ignored it. Others filed it away as another minor crisis in the outer territories. But one signal found its way to a small monitoring station on the edge of human space, where a communications officer named Lisa Stone was finishing her night shift. Lisa had been monitoring alien transmissions for 3 years, mostly listening to trade negotiations and diplomatic chatter. She'd never heard anything like the Valoran distress call. The translation software had some trouble with their language, but the meaning was clear enough. An entire species was about to be wiped out, and they were begging for help. She forwarded the message to Earth Command immediately. Within 6 hours, Admiral Ross sat in his office reading the full translation. The Valorans weren't just asking for military aid. They were offering everything they had in exchange for help. Their technology, their worlds, their entire civilization. They would become servants if necessary. Anything to survive. Ross had seen plenty of desperate messages during his 40 years in the space fleet. Pirates, slavers, natural disasters, civil wars. But this was different. This wasn't about politics or resources. This was about a peaceful species facing complete extinction from something they didn't understand and couldn't fight. He called his senior staff together within the hour. Sir, Captain Rivers said, reading through the intelligence. Report. The Valorans aren't even in our sector. We have no treaty obligations, no economic interests in their territory. Command might question why we're getting involved. Since when do we need a treaty to help people who are dying? Ross replied. The Devourers have consumed at least 20 worlds that we know of. If we don't stop them now, how long before they reach human space? The logistics alone would be massive, another officer pointed out. We're talking about deploying forces thousands of light years from our nearest base. Ross stood up and walked to the star map on his wall. He found the Valoran territories, small blue dots surrounded by vast empty space. They looked so insignificant compared to the major galactic powers, but they represented billions of lives. Prep. The Iron Will and 2 support vessels, he ordered. Captain Rivers, you'll lead the expedition. Take whatever you need. Marines, engineers, scientists, medical teams. If these Devourers can be stopped, we're going to stop them. Sir, Rivers said carefully, what if Command orders us to stand down? Ross smiled grimly. Then we'll apologize afterward. Sometimes you have to do what's right first and ask for permission later. As word spread through the human fleet, volunteers stepped forward faster than they could be processed. Marines who had never heard of Valorans signed up for what might be a suicide mission. Engineers packed experimental weapons that had never been tested in real combat. Doctors prepared for injuries from creatures they knew nothing about. The Iron Will launched 3 days later, followed by the support ships Defiant and New Hope. Their destination was 12,000 light years away, in a part of the galaxy where humans had never been welcome. They carried no guarantees of success, no promise of support from home, and no clear idea of what they would face when they arrived. All they knew was that someone had called for help, and humans had answered. The Iron Will dropped out of hyperspace, just as the first bioships began their descent toward Valoran Prime. Captain Rivers stood on the bridge watching the massive organic vessels drift through space like living mountains. They moved with a horrible grace, their surfaces pulsing with veins of sickly light. Smaller creatures swarmed around them like insects, heading toward the planet's orbital defense stations. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Cole from the sensor station. "Those things are huge. The largest one is nearly 8 kilometers long." Rivers watched through the main screen as the Valoran defense fleet tried to intercept the bioships. The alien vessels were elegant and fast, but they fought like they were trying not to hurt anyone. Their weapons seemed designed to disable rather than destroy. Against an enemy that wanted to consume every living thing in the galaxy, such tactics were worse than useless. "Sir," came a voice from the communication station. "We're receiving a transmission from the Valoran flagship. They want to know who we are." "Put them through," Rivers ordered. The screen flickered and showed the face of a Valoran commander. He had the same large eyes and gentle features as his species, but Rivers could see fear and exhaustion written across his expression. "Unknown vessels. This is Commander Dale of the Valoran Defense Fleet. Please identify yourselves and state your business in our territory." "Commander Dale, this is Captain Rivers of the human ship Iron Will. We received your distress call. We're here to help." Dale's eyes widened in surprise. "Humans? We sent that call to everyone, but we never expected anyone to actually come. Especially not from so far away." "Well, we're here now," Rivers said. "What's the situation?" "We're losing," Dale admitted. "The Devourers landed on 3 worlds before we even knew they were in our space. Now they're attacking our home world. Our weapons barely slow them down. Every hour we delay, more of our people die." Rivers could see explosions lighting up the planet's atmosphere as Devourer drop pods crashed into the major cities. The orbital defense platforms were firing continuously, but their beams seemed to have little effect on the organic ships. "We need to get down there," Rivers said. "Can you provide landing coordinates?" "Captain, with respect, you have 3 ships against hundreds of biovessels. What can you possibly do that our entire fleet cannot?" Rivers smiled grimly. "We can. Fight dirty." The Iron Will and her escort ships dove toward the planet, while the Valoran fleet watched in amazement. The human ships moved with an aggressive confidence that no Valoran had ever seen before. They didn't try to avoid the Devourer creatures. Instead, they flew straight into the swarm, weapons blazing. Major Clark stood in the dropship bay, checking his armor one final time. Around him, 200 human Marines prepared for what would likely be the hardest fight of their lives. They'd studied the intelligence reports during the journey. The Devourers didn't just kill their enemies. They converted them into more Devourers, adding their biomass to the collective. It was a fate worse than death. "Listen up," Clark shouted over the noise of the engines. "We're going into a hot zone with no backup and no way home if this goes wrong. The aliens we're trying to save have never seen real combat. They're going to be shocked by how we fight. Don't let that slow you down. These Devourers want to eat everyone on this planet. Our job is to make sure they choke on it." The Marines cheered and slammed their fists against their chest armor. They were scared, but they were also eager to fight. That was the human way. When faced with impossible odds, they got angry instead of giving up. Dr. Walsh wrote in the command dropship with her scientific team. As the ship's xenobiologist, her job was to study the Devourers and find their weaknesses. She'd read every report from the consumed worlds, looking for patterns in how the creatures operated. The data was limited, but she had some theories about their biology. "The Devourers seem to work as a collective intelligence," she explained. To Captain Rivers over the com. "Individual creatures are specialized for different tasks. Some are builders, some are fighters, some are converters. If we can disrupt their communication, we might be able to confuse them." "How do we do that?" Rivers asked. "I'm working on it. But first, I need live samples to study." The dropships hit the ground hard in the middle of Valoran Prime's capital city. The Marines deployed immediately, setting up defensive positions around the landing zone. What they saw made even the veteran soldiers stop and stare. Devourers had transformed half the city into something that belonged in a nightmare. Buildings were covered in organic growths that pulsed with alien life. Streets had become rivers of some kind of biological fluid. And everywhere, creatures that had once been Valorans wandered through the twisted landscape. They still looked partly like the peaceful herbivores, but their bodies had been changed. Extra limbs, rows of teeth, eyes that glowed with hungry light. Sweet Jesus, whispered Sergeant Adams. What did they do to those people? They made them into more devourers, Dr. Walsh said, her face pale but determined. The conversion process seems to preserve some of the original personality while changing the body and mind to serve the collective. A group of converted Valorans noticed the humans and began moving toward them with shambling steps. Major Clark raised his rifle. Sir, one of his Marines called out. Those used to be civilians, women and children. Not anymore, Clark replied. They're weapons now. Weapons designed to kill us and turn us into more of them. The first battle was brief and brutal. The converted Valorans were stronger than normal humans, but they moved slowly and seemed confused by the aggressive human tactics. The Marines had trained for urban combat against thinking enemies. The Devourers fought more like wild animals, relying on numbers and biological advantages rather than strategy. But there were so many of them. Fall back to the secondary position, Clark ordered after the fifth wave of attackers. We can't hold this street. The humans retreated in good order, covering each other and making the Devourers pay for every meter of ground. But they were outnumbered 50-1, and more creatures kept arriving from the converted parts of the city. Commander Dale watched the battle from orbit, his face filled with amazement and horror. The humans fought with a savagery that shocked him. They showed no mercy to the converted Valorans, treating them as enemies to be destroyed rather than victims to be saved. It went against everything his people believed about the value of life, but it was also working. The small human force had held off attacks that would have overwhelmed an entire Valoran regiment. They moved like predators, working together with deadly efficiency. Where Valorans hesitated to harm even their converted neighbors, humans struck without delay. Commander, his aide said quietly, the humans are requesting evacuation support for civilian areas. They want us to coordinate with their ground forces. Dale nodded slowly. Do it. Follow their lead. I think we're about to learn what real war looks like. Down on the planet, Dr. Walsh worked frantically in her mobile laboratory while Marines held the perimeter. She'd managed to collect tissue samples from several devourer creatures, and what she found disturbed her more than she'd expected. Conversion process is incredibly sophisticated, she reported to Captain Rivers. It doesn't just change the body. It rewrites the entire nervous system to connect with the collective consciousness. But there might be a way to reverse it, if we can understand the biological mechanisms involved. How long do you need? Rivers asked. Days, maybe weeks, and I need more samples. Preferably from creatures that haven't been converted yet. I'll see what we can do. The battle raged for 18 hours before the humans were forced to pull back to the spaceport. They'd saved thousands of Valoran civilians and learned valuable information about devourer tactics, but the cost had been high. 30 Marines were dead, and twice that many were wounded. Major Clark stood in the evacuation zone, watching the last dropships lift off with Valoran refugees. His armor was cracked and stained with alien blood, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. Sir, Sergeant Adams approached him. The Valorans want to know if we're abandoning the planet. Clark looked up at the sky where the Iron Will waited in orbit. They'd bought time and saved lives, but the planet was still doomed unless they could find a way to stop the Devourer Collective. It was a problem unlike anything humans had ever faced. Not abandoning, he said finally. Regrouping. We're going to figure out how to kill these things properly. In the distance, more bioships were landing, and the converted areas of the city continued to grow. The Devourers had been slowed, but not stopped. The real war was just beginning. The moon of Kiris had once been a peaceful mining station where Valorans extracted rare crystals from deep underground. Now it served as the last fortress between the Devourers and the remaining Valoran worlds. Captain Rivers stood in the command center, watching as refugee ships arrived every few hours carrying survivors from the fallen planets. Dr. Walsh had converted an entire section of the mining facility into a research laboratory. For 3 weeks, she had been studying the Devourer samples they'd collected from Valoran Prime. Her findings were both fascinating and terrifying. The Devourers aren't just one species, she explained to the assembled commanders. They're a collection of different creatures that have been joined together by some kind of biological network. Each type has a specific job: warriors, builders, converters, scouts. But they all share the same collective mind. Commander Dale listened with growing horror. You mean they were once separate species like us? Exactly. The Devourers consume entire civilizations and add their biological advantages to the collective. They've probably absorbed hundreds of different species over the centuries. That's what makes them so dangerous. They have the combined knowledge and abilities of everyone they've ever conquered. Major Clark sat forward in his chair. So how do we kill something like that? We target the network, Walsh replied. The individual creatures are connected through a complex biological communication system. If we can disrupt that connection, they become confused and disorganized. I've been working on a chemical compound that might interfere with their neural pathways. Captain Rivers studied the data on his screen. How would we deploy something like that? We'd need to get close to their main forces. That's where the real problem lies, Walsh continued. The network has multiple backup systems. To really damage it, we'd need to attack the primary node. And according to our intelligence, that's located on Thaler, the first planet they consumed in our territory. The room fell silent. Everyone knew that Thaler was completely under Devourer control now. The entire planet had been converted into a living weapon, its surface covered with biostructures that could produce new creatures at an incredible rate. It's a suicide mission, Dale said quietly. Maybe, Rivers replied. But if we don't try, they'll eventually overwhelm all our defenses anyway. At least this way we have a chance. Over the following days, the humans began teaching the Valorans new ways to fight. It went against everything the peaceful species believed, but desperation had made them willing to learn. Sergeant Adams worked with a group of young Valoran volunteers in the training facilities deep inside the moon. The aliens were quick learners, but they struggled with the concept of aggression. You're thinking too much, Adams told a Valoran named Ben, who kept hesitating during combat drills. When something wants to kill you, you don't negotiate with. You kill it first. But what if there's another way? Ben asked. What if we could find a method to convert them back to their original forms? Adam shook his head. Maybe someday. But right now, today, they're trying to eat your entire species. You can worry about saving them after you save yourselves. It was a harsh lesson, but the Valorans were beginning to understand. Their survival instincts, buried under thousands of years of peaceful civilization, were slowly awakening. Engineer Kane had been working with Valoran technicians to modify their weapons. The aliens had incredible technology, but it was all designed for construction and exploration rather than warfare. Kane's job was to turn their tools into weapons. Your energy projectors are actually more powerful than our military lasers, he explained to a Valoran engineer named Max. You just need to focus the beam and increase the power output. But won't that damage the delicate systems? Max asked. That's the point. We want to damage things. We want to break them so badly they can't be fixed. It was a difficult concept. for the Valorans to accept. Their entire culture was built around creation and growth. The idea of deliberately destroying something went against their deepest beliefs, but they were learning fast. Dr. Walsh made her breakthrough on the 20th day of their stay on Karas. She had been studying the communication patterns between devourer creatures when she noticed something interesting. They use a specific frequency to coordinate their actions, she explained to Captain Rivers. It's like a biological radio signal that connects all the creatures in a local area. If we can generate a counter frequency, we might be able to scramble their communications. How effective would that be? Rivers asked. In a small area, very effective. The creatures would lose coordination and start acting independently. But the effect would only last as long as we could maintain the signal. Rivers nodded thoughtfully. It's not a permanent solution, but it might give us the edge we need in battle. The first test of their new tactics came sooner than expected. A devourer scouting force found Karas and began probing the moon's defenses. Unlike their previous encounters, this time the humans and Valorans fought together as a coordinated force. Lieutenant Cole led a mixed squadron of human and Valoran fighters against the bioships approaching the moon. The Valorans had learned to fly aggressively, using their superior speed and maneuverability to support the more heavily armed human ships. Remember what we practiced, Cole called over the comm. Hit and run. Don't try to match them strength. For strength, the battle was fierce but brief. The combined tactics worked better than anyone had expected. The Valorans provided precision strikes while the humans delivered heavy firepower. When the devourer creatures tried to coordinate their response, Dr. Walsh's jamming signal disrupted their communications. For the first time since the war began, they achieved a clear victory. Commander Dale watched the battle from the command center, amazed by what he saw. His people were fighting with a determination he'd never witnessed before. They had learned not just human tactics, but human attitudes about warfare. They're not the same species they were a month ago, he said to Captain Rivers. War changes everyone, Rivers replied. The question is whether the change makes you stronger or breaks you completely. After the victory, morale on Karas improved dramatically. The Valorans began to believe they might actually survive the Devourer invasion. But the humans knew better. The scouting force had been small, probably sent to gather information rather than launch a real attack. Major Clark gathered his senior staff to plan their next move. The Devourers know where we are now. They'll be back with a much larger force. We need to take the fight to them before they can organize a proper assault. The primary node on Thaler? It's our best option, maybe our only option. Dr. Walsh had been working on improvements to her biological weapon. I think I can create something more effective now. A virus that specifically targets the Devourer neural network. But it needs to be introduced directly into their primary communication hub. How close do we need to get? Rivers asked. Close enough to touch it. The planning took another week. They would take a small, fast force to Thaler and attempt to penetrate the planet's defenses. It would require precision flying, perfect timing, and more luck than any reasonable person should expect. But they had no other choice. On the night before the mission, Captain Rivers found himself standing in the observation deck where Chancellor Neff had first received the terrible news about the Devourer attacks. The old Valoran leader approached him quietly. Captain, I want to thank you for what your people have done. You came to help strangers with no thought of reward or benefit to yourselves. Rivers looked out at the stars, thinking about Earth and the life he'd left behind. That's what people do for each other. When somebody calls for help, you answer. Not everyone thinks that way, Neff replied. The major powers of the galaxy abandoned us without a second thought. Then they're fools. Today it's your people under attack. Tomorrow it might be theirs. We're all in this together, whether we admit it or not. The next morning, the Iron Will and her escort ships prepared to leave Karas. They carried the hopes of an entire species and a weapon that might save the galaxy. But they also carried the knowledge that most of them would probably not return. As the ships entered hyperspace, heading toward the heart of Devourer territory, every person aboard understood the weight of what they were attempting. They were not just fighting for the Valorans anymore. They were fighting for the right of peaceful species everywhere to exist without fear. The war had changed them all, human and Valoran alike. They had learned to fight not because they enjoyed violence, but because sometimes fighting was the only way to protect what mattered most. The Thaler system looked like something from hell itself when the human fleet arrived. What had once been a beautiful world with blue oceans and green continents was now a pulsing mass of organic structures. The entire planet seemed alive, breathing, and writhing in space like a giant heart. Bioships drifted around it in lazy orbits, feeding off the planet's converted atmosphere. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered Lieutenant Cole from the pilot's seat of his fighter. "What did they do to that place?" Captain Rivers watched the sensor readings with growing dread. "They turned it into a factory. A living factory that produces more devourers." The mission plan was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. They had to penetrate the planet's defenses, reach the core where the primary hive node was located, and deploy Dr. Walsh's biological weapon. The problem was getting through hundreds of bioships and thousands of defensive creatures without being detected. "Remember," Dr. Walsh said over the com from her position in the Iron Will Science Bay, "we only get one shot at this. If the hive node detects the virus before it can spread through the network, they'll adapt their defenses. The weapon will be useless." Commander Dale led a squadron of modified Valoran ships alongside the human forces. His people had learned much about combat in the past weeks, but this would be their greatest test. They were no longer the peaceful herbivores who had first called for help. War had changed them into something harder, more determined. "All ships, begin the approach," Rivers ordered. "Stay tight and follow the plan. If we get separated in there, we'll never find each other again." The first wave of attacks came from the bioships patrolling the outer system. These creatures were larger than anything they'd faced before, some nearly as big as human destroyers. But they moved slowly, like sleeping giants disturbed from their rest. Major Clark's dropships launched from the Iron Will's Bay, heading for a different target, while the main fleet drew attention with their assault on the planet. His Special Forces team would attempt to reach the surface through the planet's polar region, where the defenses were supposed to be lighter. "This is insane," muttered Sergeant Adams as their dropship shook from enemy fire. "We're flying into the mouth of a monster." "Wouldn't be the first time," Clark replied. "Remember the training exercises on Mars? Those were worse than this." "Those were training exercises, sir. This is real." All the more reason to do it right. The dropship carried a mixed crew of humans and Valorans, all volunteers who knew they were probably flying to their deaths. Among them was Ben, the young Valoran who had struggled with the concept of aggressive warfare. He sat quietly, checking his modified weapon for the 10th time. "You scared?" Adams asked him. "Terrified," Ben admitted. "But also angry. They destroyed my home world. They killed my family. I want to make them pay for that." Adams nodded approvingly. "Good. Anger will keep you alive when fear tries to freeze." "You up." Above them, the space battle raged with desperate intensity. The human and Valoran ships worked together with a coordination that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. Where the humans provided heavy firepower, the Valorans offered speed and precision. When Devourer creatures tried to surround the slower human ships, Valoran fighters darted in to break up the attack formations. Lieutenant Cole found himself in the middle of the largest dogfight of his career. Biofighters swarmed around his ship like angry insects, their organic weapons spitting streams of corrosive acid. His Valoran wingman, a pilot named Ray, stayed close beside him. Their two ships moving together as if they were connected by invisible wires. Cole, brake left. Ray shouted over the com. Cole rolled his fighter hard to port, just as a massive tentacle swept through the space where he'd been flying. The bioship that had attacked him was the size of a building, its surface covered with weapon pods and sensor clusters that looked like eyes. "Thanks for the save," Cole called back. "Don't mention it. We're even now." They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other. Dr. Walsh worked frantically in her mobile laboratory while the battle raged around her. The virus was ready, but she needed to make final adjustments to ensure it would work in the hostile environment of the hive node. One mistake, one wrong calculation, and the entire mission would fail. "How much longer?" Captain Rivers asked over the intercom. 5 minutes, maybe less. "The virus is stable, but I need to program the delivery system. We might not have 5 minutes. The planet's defenses are waking up." Rivers was right. Across Thuller's surface, massive structures were emerging from the organic landscape. They looked like flowers made of bone and metal, opening their petals to reveal weapon systems that defied human understanding. Energy beams lanced out from the planet, striking at the attacking fleet with deadly precision. The Iron Will shuddered as one of the beams grazed her hull. Warning lights flashed across the bridge as damage reports came in from all sections. "Hull breach on Deck 7, reported the damage control officer. "We're losing atmosphere." "Seal it off," Rivers ordered. "How long until we reach the drop point?" 3 minutes, came the reply from the navigation station. On the surface, Major Clark's team had managed to reach the polar region without being detected. But what they found there made them realize why the defenses had seemed lighter in this area. The entire polar ice cap had been converted into something that resembled a giant brain, its surface covered with neural pathways that pulsed with sickly light. "That's not natural," Ben whispered, staring at the grotesque landscape. "Nothing about this place is natural anymore," Clark replied. "But it means we're close to the hive node. It's probably directly below us." They began their descent into the organic tunnels that led toward the planet's core. The walls around them were alive, covered with sensory organs that tracked their movement. Occasionally, they encountered groups of converted creatures that had once been the planet's original inhabitants. Clark's team dealt with them quickly and quietly, but each encounter reminded them of what they were fighting to prevent. "Sir," Adams called softly. "Movement ahead, lots of it." Clark crept forward to look around the corner. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber filled with devourer creatures of every size and type. At the center of the chamber stood something that might have once been the planet's governing council. They had been converted but not destroyed, their minds linked to the hive node while their bodies served as organic control systems. "That's our target," Clark said grimly. "The virus has to be introduced directly into those control units." "How do we get through all those creatures?" Ben asked. "We don't sneak through them," Clark replied. "We go through them the hard way." The final assault began with a coordinated attack from both space and ground. As the Iron Will and her escorts launched their last desperate assault on the planet's orbital defenses, Clark's team stormed the hive node chamber with everything they had. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Humans and Valorans fought side by side against creatures that defied description. Some were the size of buildings, others moved like liquid shadow. All of them were focused on stopping the intruders from reaching the hive node. Sergeant Adams found himself separated from the main group, fighting alongside Ben against a creature that seemed to be made of living metal. The young Valoran had overcome his peaceful instincts completely, fighting with a ferocity that impressed even the veteran human soldier. "I've got it cornered," Ben shouted. "Can you get behind it?" Adams rolled under the creature's sweeping arm and came up behind it with his plasma rifle. "Got it. Fire." They brought down the creature together, but more were already approaching from deeper in the tunnel. "Adams, Ben, fall back to the main chamber. Clark's voice crackled over the comm. "We're making our run now." Dr. Walsh's virus was ready. The delivery system was a modified grenade that would scatter the biological weapon throughout the chamber when it exploded. But someone had to get close enough to the hive node to deploy it manually. "I'll do it," Clark said, taking the device from his equipment pack. "Sir, that's a suicide run," Adams protested. "Those control units are surrounded by the worst creatures we've seen." "Then we better make it count," Clark replied. The final charge was everything the human military had trained for and more. Clark led his team directly at the heart of the Devourer network while his people provided covering fire. Creatures that had once been rational beings threw themselves at the attackers with mindless hunger. Clark reached the control units just as his ammunition ran out. Behind him, his team was being overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies. He pulled the pin on the virus grenade and held it against the central control node. "Tell my wife I kept my promise," he said into his comm. The explosion that followed sent the virus racing through the biological network that connected every Devourer creature on the planet. Within seconds, the effect began to spread to the bioships in orbit and then outward to other Devourer-controlled worlds. The hive mind that had consumed dozens of civilizations began to collapse. Individual creatures lost their connection to the collective, becoming confused and disoriented. Some simply stopped moving altogether. Others began attacking each other as their programming broke down. From space, Captain Rivers watched as the planet's defenses went silent. The bioships that had been attacking his fleet began to drift aimlessly, their organic weapons no longer firing. "Did it work?" he asked Dr. Walsh. "It's working," she replied, monitoring the biological readings. "The network is collapsing. The virus is spreading faster than they can adapt to it." But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Major Clark's team was gone, along with many of the brave souls who had volunteered for the mission. They had given their lives to save 2 species and possibly the entire galaxy. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time since it began, there was hope. The collapse of the Devourer network spread across the galaxy like a wave of liberation. On dozens of worlds, the collective consciousness that had held billions of converted creatures together for centuries suddenly went silent. Some creatures simply died when their artificial neural connections failed. Others reverted to confused individual minds that no longer remembered why they were fighting. Captain Rivers stood on the bridge of the Iron Will, watching the planet Thaler through the main screen. The horrible organic structures that had covered its surface were already beginning to decay. Without the hive mind to coordinate their functions, the biological systems were breaking down. It would take years, maybe decades, but the planet might eventually be habitable again. "Captain," Lieutenant Cole reported from the sensor station, "we're receiving transmissions from the other Devourer-controlled worlds. The bioships are going dark one by one. It looks like the virus is spreading through their entire network." Dr. Walsh worked at her portable laboratory, monitoring the biological data streaming in from across the galaxy. The virus she had created was more effective than she had dared hope. It was not just disrupting the Devourer communications. It was actually reversing some of the conversion processes, allowing absorbed creatures to regain their original forms. "Some of the converted beings are returning to normal," she announced to the bridge crew. "Not all of them, but enough to matter. We might be able to save millions of people who were thought lost forever." The rescue operations began immediately. Human and Valoran ships worked together to evacuate survivors from the dying Devourer worlds. Many of the rescued beings were from species that had been conquered decades or even centuries earlier. They emerged from the collapsed biostructures confused and traumatized, but alive and free. Commander Dale led the evacuation efforts in the Kira system, where several bioships had crashed on the moon's surface. His people had become experts at dangerous rescue operations during their weeks of fighting alongside the humans. They moved through the wreckage with confidence, no longer the timid herbivores who had first called for help. "Careful with that section," Dale called to his rescue team. "The biomatter is still active. It might try to defend itself." Ben worked alongside human marines to cut through the organic hull of a crashed ship. Inside, they found dozens of creatures that had once been members of a species called the Kelleri. They were slowly changing back to their original forms as the conversion process reversed itself. "They're going to need medical attention," Ben told Sergeant Adams. "The reversal process is painful, but they should recover completely." Adams nodded, watching the rescued aliens with a mixture of relief and amazement. "A month ago, I never would have believed something like this was possible. Fighting alongside aliens, saving people from other worlds. It feels like something out of a story." "It is a story," Ben replied. "Our story. The story of what happens when people refuse to give up on each other." The celebrations on Valoran Prime were unlike anything the peaceful species had ever experienced. For the first time in their history, they were celebrating a military victory. But it was more than that. They were celebrating their survival and their transformation from helpless victims into capable defenders of their own freedom. High Chancellor Neth stood before a crowd of thousands in the capital city. The scars of the Devourer attack were still visible in the damaged buildings and converted areas that were slowly being cleaned up. But the people gathered here were no longer the same Valorans who had faced extinction just months earlier. "We called for help," Neth said, his voice carrying across the crowded square. "And the humans answered. They came from thousands of light years away, with no promise of reward, no treaty binding them to our cause. They came simply because we needed help, and they were the kind of people who answer when others call." The crowd cheered, but Neth raised his hand for quiet. "But this victory belongs to all of us. We learned to fight not because we love war, but because sometimes fighting is the only way to protect what we cherish. We learned that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when the cost is high." Captain Rivers watched the ceremony from the human embassy that had been hastily established in the Valoran capital. Around him, his surviving crew members listened to the translation of Neth's speech. Many of them were thinking about Major Clark and the others who had given their lives on Thaler. "Sir," Dr. Walsh approached him with a datapad. "I've been analyzing the long-term effects of the virus. The Devourer network is completely broken. There's no way they can rebuild it. Some individual creatures might survive, but they'll never again pose a threat to galactic civilization." "What about the converted worlds?" Rivers asked. "Most of them will recover naturally over time. The biological structures will decay, and the ecosystems will gradually return to normal. It might take generations, but life will find a way." Rivers nodded thoughtfully. "And the people we rescued? They're adjusting well. The species that were absorbed more recently are recovering quickly. The ones that were converted longer ago might need more time, but they're all grateful to be free." The political changes that followed were almost as dramatic as the military victory. The Galactic Council, embarrassed by their refusal to help the Valorans, offered immediate membership to humanity. The major powers that had ignored the Devourer threat suddenly wanted to form alliances with the species that had solved the problem. Admiral Ross arrived from Earth 2 weeks after the final battle, leading a fleet of ships loaded with supplies and aid workers. He found a galaxy that had been fundamentally changed by recent events. The humans were no longer unknown aliens from the Outer Rim. They were the species that had saved everyone else when no one else would try. "Captain Rivers," Ross said during their private meeting, "Command is very pleased with what you accomplished here. You've opened new possibilities for humanity that we never imagined." "We just did what seemed right, sir," Rivers replied. "People needed help. We helped them. That attitude is exactly why this worked. The Valorans trust you because you proved you care more about doing the right thing than about political advantage. The formal treaty signing took place on Keras, the moon that had served as the last fortress of the Alliance. Representatives from dozens of species attended, including many who had been rescued from Devourer worlds. It was the largest gathering of different alien species in galactic history. The Human-Valoran Defense Pact established more than just a military alliance. It created a new model for interspecies cooperation based on mutual aid and shared responsibility. Other peaceful species, inspired by the Valoran example, began requesting human protection and offering their own unique contributions to the alliance. Commander Dale had been promoted to admiral after the war, placing him in charge of the new Joint Defense Forces. He worked closely with the human military advisors to train Valoran units in the tactics they had learned during the crisis. But the training went both ways. Humans learned Valoran engineering techniques and gained access to technologies that had been developed over thousands of years of peaceful exploration. "The galaxy is a different place now," Dale said to Captain Rivers during a planning session. "Before the Devourers, most species kept to themselves. Everyone was afraid of getting involved in other people's problems. Now we know that we're all connected. When one species suffers, we all suffer. When one species thrives, we all benefit." Sergeant Adams had been promoted to lieutenant and assigned to train the first integrated human Valoran Special Forces unit. Ben was one of his students, along with volunteers from several other species that had joined the Defense Pact. They trained on a dozen different worlds, learning to fight in every environment imaginable. "Remember," Adams told his mixed class of alien soldiers, "we're not just preparing for the next war. We're preparing to prevent wars. Sometimes the best way to keep peace is to be so obviously dangerous that nobody wants to fight you." Ben had come a long way from the hesitant young Valoran who had struggled with the concept of violence. He was now one of the most skilled soldiers in the Alliance, capable of leading missions that would have been impossible for his people just a year earlier. "The humans taught us to fight," Ben told a group of new recruits. "But more importantly, they taught us why to fight. Not for conquest or glory, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Dr. Walsh established a new research institute dedicated to studying and countering biological threats like the Devourers. Her work led to breakthroughs in medicine and biotechnology that benefited every species in the Alliance. But her most important discovery was the proof that cooperation between different kinds of minds could solve problems that no single species could handle alone. Years later, when historians tried to analyze the turning point that saved galactic civilization, they always came back to the same simple fact. When the Valorans called for help, the humans answered. Not because they had to, not because it served their interests, but because it was the right thing to do. The galaxy learned that day that the most powerful weapon against darkness was not superior technology or greater numbers. It was the willingness of good people to help strangers in need, no matter the cost. The humans had proven that heroism was not about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing the right thing. Anyway, and in doing so, they had changed everything.